In the middle of the howling storm, the veteran Jake Reed just wanted to ignore the outside world. But Max, his German Shepherd canine, suddenly shot to his feet. He growled, rushing to the door, his urgency strange and intense. His canine instincts had heard the sharp shriek of metal from the pass. Urged on by his dog, Jake plunged into the night and discovered a horrific sight: a crushed sedan dangling precariously over the edge of an abyss. When he shined his flashlight inside, he saw a beautiful woman, unconscious, and the car was starting to slide. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The sky over Willow Creek, Oregon, had been a bruised shade of purple for 2 days, and now it had finally broken. The rain did not just fall, it arrived with a violent vertical force, turning the steep logging roads into rivers of mud and the town's single main street into a slick mirror of flickering neon from the tavern. High above the town, nestled in the dense privacy of the Cascade foothills, a single light burned in the window of a small, sturdy cabin. The wind, finding no purchase on the low roof, instead threw itself against the massive Douglas firs surrounding the clearing, creating a sound like a freight train that never passed. Inside, Jake Reed sat in a worn armchair, angled toward the wood stove. He was a man who looked carved from the same rugged landscape he hid in. In his late 30s, he was tall and lean, retaining a wiry strength that spoke of a life of hard discipline. His brown hair was grown out, slightly long and unruly, with heavy strands of silver already claiming his temples. His face was weathered, etched with lines that didn't belong on a man his age, but his eyes, when they weren't distant, held an unexpected kindness. A thick, neatly trimmed beard covered the lower half of his face, adding to his look of quiet isolation. He wore the uniform of his self-imposed solitude, a heavy plaid flannel shirt, colors of dark navy blue, bright red, and faded gray, worn over a simple gray t-shirt. His jeans were faded denim, and his feet were covered in thick wool socks. His sturdy work boots sat by the door, still caked with mud from the morning's chores. Jake was staring at the fire, but he wasn't really seeing it. His hand rested on the head of the only other living soul within miles. At his feet lay Max. Max was a large German Shepherd, but not the common black and tan. His coat was a striking wolf-like mix of silver, deep gray, and charcoal black. He was 7 years old, retired from a life that Jake rarely allowed himself to remember, and his muzzle was already turning a dignified white. Max was a creature of silent loyalty, his entire existence revolving around the man in the chair. He was, in every sense, Jake's anchor, the heavy, breathing presence that kept him from drifting away on the dark currents of his memory. The storm was loud. Every few minutes, a blast of wind would rattle the window panes, the sound sharp as gunfire. Each time, Jake's shoulders would tense, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He would close his eyes, his breathing catching, until the heavy sigh from Max beside him brought him back. He would exhale slowly, his fingers sinking deeper into the dog's thick ruff. "It's just the wind, Max," Jake murmured, his voice rough from disuse. Max, who had been dozing, let his tail thump once on the hardwood floor. His ears, however, remained erect, 2 black-tipped triangles swiveling, cataloging every sound from the storm. He was on duty. He was always on duty. The fire popped, sending a shower of orange sparks up the flue. The cabin was a bubble of warmth and light in a world of chaotic darkness. For Jake, it was the only safe place left. He had come here, to this inherited piece of land, to escape the noise, the crowds, the sudden sounds that sent his mind back to places he never wanted to see again. He had come here to be forgotten. And then a sound cut through the roar of the wind. It was a sound that did not belong. It wasn't the natural crack of a falling branch or the deep rumble of thunder. It was the long, high-pitched squeal of rubber tires fighting a losing battle on wet pavement, a desperate, unnatural sound that climbed in pitch until it was almost a scream. Jake's head lifted, his gaze sharpening. The squeal was followed, a half-second later, by a horrific, crushing sound of metal colliding with something solid, a sound of immense weight and terrible finality. It was not a thunderclap. It was a crash. It echoed off the mountains, a dull, heavy thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. Before Jake could even process the noise, Max was on his feet. He moved with a speed that belied his resting state. 1 second, he was a dozing companion. The next, he was a canine operator. A low growl rumbled deep in the shepherd's chest, a sound completely different from his usual barks at squirrels. His body was tense, hackles raised slightly, his head lowered as he moved swiftly to the cabin door. He stood there, frozen for a moment, listening, his entire body a weapon system, scanning for threats. "Max, down," Jake commanded, his voice tight. "It's nothing, just the storm, a tree falling." But Jake knew it wasn't a tree. The sound had been mechanical. Max ignored the command. He pressed his nose to the crack beneath the door, sniffing the rain-soaked air. He let out a single, sharp whine, then looked back at Jake, his dark eyes wide and electric, with an urgency that terrified his owner. "No," Jake said, standing up. "We don't get involved, boy. You know the rule. We stay here. It's safe here." The wind howled as if in agreement, trying to drown out the memory of the noise. Jake went to the window, wiping the condensation with his sleeve, but he could see nothing but the swirling black and gray of the storm. The crash had come from the direction of the pass, the narrow, winding road that was the only way into or out of Willow Creek from the north. It was a treacherous road on a clear day. Tonight, it was a death trap. Max went to the door and scratched it, one sharp, deliberate rake of his claws. "Max, stop!" Jake's voice was sharper now, edged with the panic of being pushed. Max turned back to him, and this time he let out a full, authoritative bark. It was not a plea. It was a report. It was the bark he had been trained to use when he found something, the bark that meant target acquired or danger present. It was a bark that demanded action. Jake stared at the dog. He saw the loyalty, the training, the pure, undiluted instinct that was pushing past all the walls Jake had built around himself. Max knew someone was out there, and Max intended to do something about it. The conflict in Jake's face was agonizing. To go out there, into the storm, toward an unknown danger, was to invite the chaos back in. But to ignore the dog, that was impossible. He trusted Max more than he trusted himself. Max barked again, a short, commanding sound. He was urging Jake to investigate. He was telling him they had a job to do. Jake's breathing quickened. He looked at the fire, then at the door, then back at his dog. Max was quivering, not from fear, but from anticipation. With a heavy sigh that was almost a groan, Jake moved. The decision was made. He strode to the hook by the door, pulling down his old, worn brown leather jacket. The leather was stiff and cold. He grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight from the shelf, his movements economical and precise. He jammed his sock-covered feet into his boots, not bothering with the laces. He looked at Max, who was now vibrating, his tail rigid, his eyes locked on his owner. "All right," Jake said, his voice grim. "All right, let's go see what kind of trouble you found." He unbolted the door, and the storm roared into the cabin, instantly extinguishing the fragile sense of peace. The moment the door opened, the storm became a physical assault. The wind punched the breath from Jake's chest, and the horizontal rain, as cold as ice water, hit his face with the force of 1,000 needles. He squinted, raising his arm to shield his eyes as he stepped out onto the flooded porch. Max was already off the steps, a gray shadow instantly soaked, his paws sinking into the churned mud that was once Jake's front yard. He didn't hesitate, his body low, his nose to the ground, as he moved toward the trail leading to the main road. "Max, wait!" Jake yelled, his voice sounding thin and weak against the roar of the wind. He fumbled with the flashlight, his cold fingers struggling with the switch. A cone of bright, white light cut through the rain, illuminating a world of chaos. The trail was a stream. Mud, thick and grasping, pulled at his unlaced boots with every step. This was a mistake, a profound, dangerous mistake. Every instinct, conditioned by years of avoiding the world, screamed at him to go back inside, to lock the door and put another log on the fire. But 50 yards ahead, Max paused, looked back, and let out an impatient short bark, a sound that said, "This way. Now." "I'm coming," Jake muttered, more to himself than the dog. He was not a rescuer. He was not a soldier, not anymore. He was just a man trying to be left alone. The trek to the road was a battle. It was less than a quarter mile, but it felt like miles. Branches, heavy with water, whipped his face. The mud was a living thing, trying to drag him down. But Max was relentless. The dog moved with a purpose that Jake hadn't seen since their active days, his canine training surging to the surface. He was not a pet. He was a partner, and he was on a mission. Finally, Jake stumbled onto the slick, broken pavement of the mountain pass. The wind was worse here, a solid wall of air that howled as it swept down the cleared corridor of the road. "Where, Max? What did you—" Jake stopped. His flashlight beam had found it. It was a car, or what was left of one. A dark blue sedan, angled nose down off the side of the road. The rear of the vehicle was horribly crushed, as if a giant had stomped on it. Two massive muddy ruts, far too big for the sedan, were visible on the shoulder, leading away from the wreck and disappearing up the pass. The truck that had hit it was long gone. This was not an accident. This was an execution. But the car hadn't gone all the way. It was balanced in a way that defied physics. The front half of the sedan was suspended over the black emptiness of the ravine, held back only by a tangle of exposed roots and a large boulder that had snagged its rear axle. The ground beneath it, a saturated mix of mud and shale, was actively crumbling. A high-pitched metallic squeal reached him over the wind as the car shifted, settling a few more inches toward the drop. "No," Jake whispered, his blood running cold. Before he could take a step, Max was in motion. The dog, ignoring the unstable road, scrambled over the edge. He half slid, half climbed down the treacherous muddy slope, his claws digging for purchase. He didn't stop until he reached a small, flat-topped rock directly beside the driver's side door, which hung suspended over the void. Max looked up at the window and let out a series of sharp, rapid barks. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. The sound of the dog, the rain, the sight of the wreck, it all threatened to overwhelm him, to send him spiraling. But then, through the flashlight's beam, he saw it. A hand, pressed weakly against the inside of the driver's window. In an instant, the fog of his PTSD did not vanish, but it was violently shoved aside by a different, colder, and more powerful force: his training. There was no more wind. There was no more past. There was only the patient. "Max, hold!" Jake commanded, his voice changing, dropping into the authoritative tone of a man used to giving orders in chaos. He slid down the embankment, mirroring Max, his boots finding little purchase. He landed hard on the same rock as his dog, the impact jarring his teeth. The car groaned again, shifting under its own weight. He aimed the flashlight beam through the window. Inside was a woman. She was slumped against the door, her head pressed to the glass. She was beautiful, even in this state. Her face was pale, framed by dark, wet hair plastered to her skin. Blood was visible at her temple, a dark rivulet mixing with the rain. This was Elena Hayes, though Jake did not know her name. He only knew she was alive. "Ma'am," he yelled, pounding on the glass. "Can you hear me?" Max barked again, a sharp, steady rhythm. The woman's eyelids fluttered. She let out a small, quiet sound, a gasp of pain. She was conscious, but barely. "Max, good boy. Keep her talking," Jake said. He knew the dog's barks were acting as a lifeline, a persistent sound in the dark that was keeping her from slipping away. He grabbed the door handle. It was jammed, the frame bent. "Stand back, Max." Jake planted his feet, aimed the flashlight at the woman so he could see her, and put his entire weight into a single, desperate pull. The metal shrieked in protest, but the latch gave. The door swung open with a sickening crunch. The woman slumped forward, held only by her seatbelt. "Okay," Jake said, his medic training flowing through him. "Let's get you out of here." He braced his knee against the car's frame, careful not to shift its balance. He reached in, his fingers finding her neck, checking for a pulse. It was there, thready, but fast. He gently supported her head, keeping her spine as straight as possible. "My name is Jake. I'm going to get you out. Don't move your head." He fumbled for his pocket, his hand closing around the cold steel of his utility knife. He flipped it open and in one motion sliced through the nylon seatbelt. She was free, and she was heavy, a dead weight. At that exact moment, a terrible sound came from beneath the car, a wet, tearing sound. The mud and roots were giving way. The boulder was shifting. "Max, up, go!" Jake yelled. The dog scrambled up the bank. "We have to go, now!" Jake roared. He hooked his arms under the woman's, locked his hands across her chest, and pulled. He fell backward onto the slope, dragging her dead weight with him, his boots sliding in the mud. He had her halfway out when the car made its final decision. A low groan of tortured metal, loud and final, echoed through the pass. The front end of the sedan dipped. The rear axles scraped, and then, with a terrible final lurch, the car was free. It tipped forward, hung in the air for one agonizing second, and then vanished into the ravine. Jake, still holding the woman, scrambled backward on his hands and heels, fighting the mud, adrenaline surging through him. The car fell. It didn't make one sound. It made 100. The sharp cracks of breaking trees, the scream of metal tearing against rock, and then, far, far below, a final muffled impact that sounded like the world ending. And then, silence. There was nothing but the sound of the wind, the hiss of the rain, and the harsh, ragged sound of Jake's own breathing. He lay in the mud, halfway up the slope, the woman's unconscious form sprawled across his chest. He was soaked, he was cold, he was covered in mud. And he was alive. Max was at the top of the embankment, looking down, his body rigid. Jake closed his eyes, just for a second, letting the rain wash the sweat from his face. He had pulled her out. He had saved her. He had just dragged the entire complicated, dangerous world right back into his life. The fluorescent lights of the Willow Creek Community Clinic were an assault. They hummed with an irritating, high-pitched buzz, painting the small, sterile room in a sickly yellow-green light that made everything look sicker. Elena Hayes awoke to the smell of antiseptic and the dull, rhythmic throb of her own pulse in her head. She blinked, and the room swam. "Easy now, ma'am. You're safe." The voice was deep and a little tired. She turned her head, a sharp stab of pain reminding her not to move so fast. A man stood by the small window, which was streaked with rain. He was in a sheriff's uniform, but it was rumpled, the color of wet sand. He was a man in his late 50s, with a kind, lined face and a graying mustache. He had the weary eyes of someone who had seen too many long nights, but they held no trace of malice. This was Sheriff Ben Carter. What happened?" Elena asked, her voice a dry rasp. "You were in an accident," Carter said, moving closer. "Up on the pass. A man and his dog brought you in. You've got a mild concussion and a few cracked ribs, but the doc says you'll be fine. You were very lucky." Elena's memory came rushing back, not in a wave, but in a series of sharp, terrifying snapshots. The headlights in her mirror, the immense dark shape of the truck, the sound of metal screaming. "It wasn't an accident, Sheriff," she said, her voice hardening, cutting through the fog of pain. "I was run off the road. A truck, a logging truck, it hit me." Sheriff Carter's kind eyes narrowed. He pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket. "We found the ruts. You're right. Heavy rig, dual axle. They hit you, and they hit you hard. Did you get a look at the driver?" Elena shook her head, then regretted it. "No, it was too fast, but I know who sent them." She took a breath, meeting his gaze. "I'm an investigative journalist. I'm here looking into Blackwood logging." The air in the room seemed to go still. The hum of the lights suddenly felt louder. Sheriff Carter stopped writing. He slowly closed the notebook and tucked it back into his pocket. He looked at the door, then back at Elena. "Ms. Hayes," he said, lowering his voice, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I was afraid of this." He pulled the visitor's chair closer to her bed and sat down, leaning in. Willow Creek is a small town. Blackwood, he owns most of it. The mill, the diner, half the town council. I'm just one man, and I've been trying to build a case against him for illegal dumping, but I keep hitting walls." He leaned in even closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I can't protect you, not officially, not here." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Carter said, his face etched with a pained frustration, "that I suspect my own deputy is on his payroll. I can't prove it. Not yet, but I see him taking lunches with Blackwood's foreman. Reports go missing. My patrol car had 2 flat tires this morning, right after I got the call about you. If I put you in protective custody at the station, I might as well be handing you straight to them." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. "There's only one person I trust in this entire valley," Carter continued. "The man who brought you in, Jacob Reed. He lives completely off the grid. No phone, no mail, and his cabin is a fortress. Blackwood doesn't even know he exists. It's the only safe place." The clinic's waiting room was small and smelled of stale coffee and wet wool. Jake stood near the exit, his arms crossed, his body vibrating with a tension that was almost visible. He hated this place. He hated the lights, the sounds, the antiseptic air. Max lay at his feet, a silent gray wolf in the corner, his head up, his ears swiveling, monitoring every sound. He was as out of place here as Jake. The door to the treatment area opened. Carter emerged, pushing Elena, who was now dressed in a set of borrowed green scrubs, her arm in a sling. She looked pale and bruised, but her eyes were clear and sharp. She was a fighter. Jake's entire body tensed. He wanted to be gone. He had done his part. "Jake," Carter said, his voice carrying the heavy weight of a request, "I need a favor." Jake's jaw tightened. He didn't look at Elena. He looked at Ben Carter, the man he had known, in some capacity, his entire life. "Ben, no," Jake said. His voice was flat, cold, and final. "I brought her in. That's it. I'm not a part of this. I'm done." Elena flinched slightly at his tone. This was the man who had pulled her from the car? This cold, distant person? "Jake, you don't understand," Carter said, stepping between Jake and the door. "They tried to kill her. Blackwood, and I can't protect her. You're the only one." "That's not my problem," Jake said, his voice dangerously low. He took a step toward the exit. "I'm not getting involved, not in this, not in anything. We're leaving." "Jake?" Carter's voice was sharp, stopping him. Jake turned, his eyes flashing with a trapped, angry light. Carter looked at Elena, then back at Jake. He walked closer, forcing Jake to look at him. He lowered his voice, the sound full of a history that Elena couldn't understand. "Jacob," Carter said, using his full name. "Your father. Michael. He was my best friend. He was my partner for 15 years. I held you the day you were born. I know what you went through over there. I know why you want to be left alone." Jake's expression wavered, the ice cracking. A deep, profound pain flashed in his eyes. "I would never," Carter said, his voice thick with emotion, "ever put you at risk if it wasn't the last resort. I would never ask this of you. But that woman, she's as good as dead if she stays here. Blackwood's mole will know she's alive within the hour. I'm not asking you as the sheriff, Jake. I'm asking you as family." The word hung in the air, heavy and unbreakable. Family. Jake stood there for a long, agonizing moment. The fluorescent lights hummed. The rain lashed the windows. He looked at Carter, the man who was the last living link to his father. He looked at Elena, a woman targeted for trying to do the right thing. He looked at Max, who was now standing, watching him, his head tilted, waiting for the command. Finally, Jake let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. He gave one short, sharp nod. The movement was full of anger, resignation, and a profound sadness. "Get her things," he growled. "I'll bring the truck around." The cabin was suffocating. It was his sanctuary, but now it was contaminated. The presence of a stranger, this woman, had changed its entire chemistry. Jake moved with a rigid, controlled fury, stoking the fire, throwing another log in with more force than necessary. Elena sat on the worn armchair, a thick wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She was exhausted, in pain, and now a prisoner in the home of a man who clearly despised her very existence. Jake was pacing. He would walk from the window to the door, check the new bolt he had just installed, and then pace back. He was a caged animal, and his tension was making her own skin crawl. You're safe here, I promise," she said, trying to break the silence. "I won't cause any trouble." Jake just grunted in response, not even looking at her. He was checking the seals on the windows, his movements jerky. His breathing was shallow. He was fighting, she realized, to control himself. He finally stopped, bracing his hands against the cold stone of the fireplace, his back to her. His knuckles were white. Max, who had been lying by the fire, let out a soft whine. He stood up, not with the urgency of the night, but with a slow, deliberate grace. He walked over to Jake. Jake's body was a statue of barely contained stress. Max didn't bark. He didn't paw. He simply pressed his heavy head against Jake's clenched fist, the one braced against the stones. He nudged it. Once, twice. Jake didn't move. Max nudged his hand again, this time pushing his cold nose into Jake's palm. And then Elena watched, amazed, as the man's entire body changed. The tension did not vanish, but it deflated. The rigid line of his shoulders softened. The hand, which had been a white-knuckled fist, slowly uncurled. His fingers, almost unconsciously, began to move, sinking into the thick, gray fur of the dog's ruff. Jake let out a long, shuddering breath, his head bowing. He turned, leaning his back against the fireplace, and slid down until he was sitting on the hearth, his hand never leaving the dog's head. Elena said nothing. She didn't dare breathe. She had just witnessed something intensely private. This wasn't a man and his pet. This was a lifeline. She realized, with a sudden aching clarity, that the dog was not just his companion. He was his anchor. He was the only thing keeping the soldier from being completely lost in the storm. A tense, heavy silence had fallen inside the cabin, a silence made deeper and more profound by the unending howl of the storm outside. The fire in the wood stove had settled into a bed of glowing orange coals, casting a warm, flickering light that made the shadows in the corners dance. Elena sat in the armchair, the wool blanket still clutched around her. She was exhausted, but sleep felt impossible. Across the small room, Jake was disassembling his utility knife on the small kitchen table, cleaning it with a focus that was almost violent. He had not spoken a word in nearly an hour, and his movements were a precise, controlled expression of his agitation. He was a man who was used to his solitude, and she was a foreign object that had disrupted his entire world. Lying on the hearth, Max had been a picture of canine peace. But suddenly he lifted his head. His ears, which had been relaxed, snapped forward. A low huff of air came from his nose. Elena watched him. He stood up, stretching first, a long, fluid movement, and then he walked away from the warmth of the fire. He went to the corner by the door, where Jake's heavy brown leather jacket hung from a peg. It was still dripping, a dark puddle forming on the wooden floorboards beneath it. Max pushed his nose against the sleeve, inhaling deeply. And then he began to act agitated. He whined, a low, anxious sound deep in his throat. He backed away from the jacket, shook his head, and then stepped forward to sniff it again. He was clearly distressed. "Is he okay?" Elena asked, her voice quiet, almost startling in the silent room. Jake's head snapped up, his hands stilling on the pieces of his knife. He looked at Max, his expression unreadable. "He's fine." "He seems upset by your jacket," she observed. Max whined again, this time looking directly at Jake. He then nudged the sleeve with his nose, a sharp, insistent gesture. Jake frowned. This was not random behavior. This was work. He set the knife blade down and stood up, walking over to the dog. "What is it, boy?" Jake murmured, his voice softer than Elena had heard it. Max backed up to let Jake approach. Jake leaned in, his own nose near the soaked leather. He inhaled. All he could smell was the storm, wet leather, pine, mud, and the faint metallic scent of the rain. "It's just wet, Max," Jake said. But Max was not satisfied. He looked at Jake, then walked pointedly over to Elena in the chair. He sniffed the blanket that was wrapped around her, the one Jake had used from his truck. He sniffed her, his nose twitching. He seemed to process the information, and then he walked, with deliberate purpose, back to the hanging jacket and nudged it again, more forcefully. The realization hit Jake like a physical blow. He had been watching the dog, and Max had just communicated a critical piece of information. Max was fine with Elena. He had processed her scent, cataloged it, and dismissed it as a threat. The jacket, however, was different. "It's not her," Jake said, his voice a low rumble. "He's fine with her. It's something on the jacket." He grabbed the jacket from the peg. It was cold and heavy. He buried his face in the shoulder, the same part of the jacket that had been exposed when he'd carried her, the same part that had rested near the door of his truck. He inhaled, forcing his senses past the cold and the wet, and then he found it. It was faint, almost completely washed away by the rain, but it was undeniably there. It was a smell that did not belong in his world. It was the rich, earthy, and slightly sweet smell of expensive cigar smoke, a scent so thick it was almost oily. And beneath that, something else, a sharp chemical smell, the unmistakable petroleum-based scent of lighter fluid. "Zippo fluid," Jake whispered, his blood turning cold. These scents hadn't come from him. They hadn't come from Elena. They had come from the crash site. But where? How? His mind raced, replaying the rescue, the rain, the mud, the car, pulling her out, scrambling up the bank. Then he remembered. He hadn't carried her all the way to the clinic. He had carried her up the bank and put her in the passenger seat of his own truck. He had laid her down on the seat, his jacket, no, the blanket. But he had been leaning in. He had been working on her in the cab of his truck before he'd driven. "The truck," he said, his voice suddenly sharp. Max let out a short, affirmative bark, as if to say, "Finally." "Stay here," Jake ordered Elena, his eyes dark and intense. "Do not open this door, for anyone." He didn't wait for a reply. He grabbed the heavy flashlight from the shelf, threw the door open, and disappeared into the howling blackness. Max was a gray streak at his heels. The rain was a deluge, instantly soaking his t-shirt and hair. He sprinted the few yards to his old pickup truck, which was parked in the mud near the cabin. He yanked the passenger door open, the interior light flickering on. Max didn't wait. He leaped into the cab, bypassing the seat itself, and jammed his head and shoulders into the gap between the passenger seat and the center console. He began sniffing frantically, a low, excited whine building in his chest. "You smell it, don't you?" Jake said, aiming the flashlight beam into the dark crevices. The floor was a mess of mud and damp leaves from the rescue. At first, he saw nothing, but Max was insistent, using his nose to push at the seat's upholstery, trying to get at something just out of reach. "Okay, boy, I see it," Jake said, though he didn't. He was trusting the dog. He shoved his hand deep into the dark gap, his fingers probing the cold metal tracks of the seat, feeling for anything. His knuckles brushed against old receipts, a stray pen, and then his fingertips hit something cold, smooth, and heavy. He grasped it, his fingers fumbling on the slick metal, and pulled it out. He held it in his palm, the flashlight beam illuminating it. It was a chrome-plated Zippo lighter. It was heavy, expensive, and looked brand new, save for a small smear of mud. Jake stared at it, the rain dripping from his hair onto the metal. This was the source of the smell. He didn't even need to open it. The faint, sharp scent of Zippo fluid clung to it. This must have been in the attacker's pocket. He must have leaned into Elena's car, maybe to check if the job was done, and it had fallen out. Or more likely, it had fallen out of his pocket and landed on Elena. And when Jake had pulled her from the wreck and placed her in his truck, it had fallen from her clothes, lost in the dark, into the gap in the seat. He turned the lighter over in his hand. His heart stopped. Engraved on the smooth, polished chrome was a logo. It was clean and precise, a stylized, bold letter B formed from the trunk of a tall pine tree surrounded by a ring of smaller firs. The Blackwood Corporation logo. Jake stood frozen in the storm, the Zippo feeling like a block of ice in his hand. The flashlight beam was steady, but his world was shaking. This was not a random attacker. This was not a coincidence. This was physical proof. The man who had run Elena off the road, the man who had left her for dead, worked for Blackwood, and he had left his calling card in Jake's truck. Jake slammed back into the cabin, a blast of wind and rain following him, making the fire in the stove gutter wildly. He was soaked to the skin, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his face grim. Elna, who had been huddled in the armchair, jumped, a small gasp escaping her. Max entered right behind Jake, a gray shadow, and immediately began a full-body shake, sending a spray of icy water across the wooden floor. "What is it?" Elena asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What did you find?" Jake didn't answer at first. He walked straight to the small kitchen table, where the oil lamp cast a pool of steady, yellow light. He raised his hand, his fist clenched. For a second, Elena thought he was angry, but then he opened his hand. With a heavy, solid sound, the chrome-plated Zippo lighter landed on the table. It spun once, the Blackwood logo catching the light. Elena leaned forward, her eyes widening. She didn't need to touch it. She recognized it instantly. "That's it," she whispered, her voice a mix of terror and vindication. "That's Blackwood's." "You're sure?" Jake's voice was a low growl. "They hand them out to their senior foreman," she said, her mind racing. It's like a badge of honor for them. I've seen them in the tavern, flashing them around." She looked up at him, her pale face suddenly sharp with a new, terrifying clarity. "My attacker was a Blackwood man." "So," Jake said, his logic moving as fast as hers, "the crash wasn't just to scare you." "No, it was to stop me." Elena stood up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. She began to pace, her movements stiff from her injuries, but driven by a new energy. I knew I was close. I had a suspicion." "About what?" "The old ranger station," she said, thinking aloud. "On the North Ridge. It's been abandoned since the 1980s, but I've been watching their operations. I kept seeing trucks, Blackwood trucks, heading up that logging road, always at night. No headlights. They weren't hauling timber. The sound of the engines was wrong. I thought they were doing illegal logging, cutting old growth, but it felt different. I had no proof, just a hunch." She stopped pacing and pointed at the Zippo. "That changes everything. This lighter proves they were there. The man who tried to kill me. He's connected to whatever is happening at that station." Jake picked up the Zippo, his large, calloused hand closing around it. The cold metal seemed to absorb all the warmth from the room. "If they're willing to kill you to protect it, it's not just illegal logging." "They think I'm dead," Elena said, her eyes locking with his. "Or dying in the clinic. They won't be expecting anyone. They won't be on guard. If we're ever going to find out what's in that station, it has to be now. This is our only chance." Jake stared at her. The idea was insane. To go back out into that storm, to walk into a trap, to get involved. Every fiber of his being screamed no. He looked at Max. The dog was sitting, watching the two humans, sensing the electric tension. "It's a 2-mile hike from the main road," Jake said, his voice flat. "In this storm, we don't know who's there." "You're a soldier, aren't you?" she challenged him, not unkindly. "I saw the way you were at the clinic. You were trained." Jake's jaw tightened. "I was," he said, the word sharp. "I'm not anymore." "Please," she whispered. "This isn't just my story. They're doing something to this valley. We have to know." He looked at the Zippo in his hand, then at Max, then at the door. He was a man trapped between a past he couldn't escape and a present he didn't want. He gave a single sharp nod. "All right," he said, "but we do this my way, quietly." He grabbed his crowbar from his toolbox. "And we take the truck." The drive was a nightmare. The old truck's wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge. Jake drove with a terrifying, focused intensity, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He parked in a deep, hidden thicket of pines, a quarter-mile downwind from the station's access road. "Lights out," he said. "From here, we walk." The hike was brutal. The road was a river of mud. The wind tried to rip the flashlight from Elena's good hand. But Jake and Max moved as one. The dog was in his element, a gray wraith moving silently through the trees, scouting 20 yards ahead, then circling back. Jake was hyper-vigilant, his head on a constant swivel, his senses so sharp they were painful. He was back in the war, and he hated it. After 20 minutes, the station emerged from the fog and rain. It was a dark, squat building, its green paint peeling, its windows either boarded up or broken, black voids. Jake put a hand on Elena's arm. "Wait." He and Max melted into the shadows. They circled the building once. Max, his nose to the ground, never gave a sign. The building was quiet, empty. Jake returned. "No one's here. Let's get this done." He didn't bother with the front door. He led them to the back, where a utility door was secured by a heavy, rusted padlock. He didn't waste time on it. He jammed the flat end of his crowbar into the wooden doorframe. With one powerful, controlled heave, the wood splintered. The sound of the breaking lock was loud, but the wind swallowed it instantly. The door screeched open on rusted hinges. The smell that hit them was thick and musty, a combination of wet rot, mildew, and animal droppings. "Stay close," Jake whispered. They entered. It was pitch black. Jake's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a single, large room. It was a disaster. Old metal desks were overturned, filing cabinets had been ripped open, and damp, useless paperwork from 2 decades ago was scattered across the floor, like dead leaves. "They're gone," Elena said, her voice hollow with disappointment. She walked over to a cabinet, pulling open a drawer. It was empty. "Whatever was here, they moved it." "No," Jake said. He was sniffing the air. "They were here, recently." "How do you know?" "The air," he said, walking toward the center of the room. "Under the mildew, it smells wrong, like oil and solvent, a chemical smell." As Jake and Elena searched the empty cabinets, Max was doing his own investigation. He was not interested in the papers. He was interested in the corners. He trotted the perimeter of the room, his nose twitching, cataloging the scents of mice and decay. Then he froze. He was standing near a large metal desk in the back corner of the room. He lowered his head, his black-tipped ears pointing forward. A low, threatening growl rumbled deep in his chest. It was not directed at Jake or Elena. It was directed at the floor. "Max?" Jake whispered. He clicked off his flashlight. Elena immediately did the same. The room was plunged into absolute darkness, filled only by the roar of the rain on the tin roof. Jake put a hand on Max's back. The dog's muscles were tense. Max growled again, and then he pawed at a single floorboard, a quick, sharp scratch of his claws. Elena whispered, "Does he smell something?" Jake put his ear to the floor. He heard the wind. He heard the rain. And then he heard it. A faint, high-pitched skittering sound accompanied by an angry chitter coming from under the floor. "It's a raccoon," Jake whispered, letting out a breath. "He's got a raccoon cornered under the building." Max, hearing the sound again, let out a single, muffled bark and scratched at the board again, more insistently. "Easy, boy," Jake said. "It's just a—" He stopped. He put his boot on the floorboard Max had been scratching. It shifted. It was loose. He looked at Elena in the darkness, though she couldn't see his face. He pressed his boot down again. A soft, dull clunk sounded as the board settled. It wasn't nailed down. "He found something," Jake said. He clicked his flashlight back on. He motioned for Max to move. "Back, boy." He knelt, jamming the hooked end of the crowbar into the gap. He pulled. The wood was soft and damp, groaning in protest, and then the board popped free. A blast of cold, damp air hit them, smelling strongly of wet fur and that same sharp chemical smell. Jake aimed his beam into the dark, shallow crawlspace. 2 bright eyes flashed, and a small masked raccoon scrambled away into the dark. But it hadn't been nesting on dirt. There, sitting on the muddy ground, was a box. It was a black, waterproof, hard plastic case, the kind used for expensive equipment. Jake reached his arm into the hole. His fingers brushed the cold plastic. He grasped the handle and pulled it out. It was heavy. He set it on the dusty floor and clicked the two heavy latches, the sound loud in the quiet station. He opened the lid. Inside, protected in sealed plastic sleeves, were papers. Elena dropped to her knees, her ribs protesting, her good hand shaking as she reached for the top sleeve. She aimed her flashlight. It was a map, a detailed geological survey of the Willow Creek Valley. On it, marked in red ink, were half a dozen coordinates. She pulled out the next item. It was a logbook. Her eyes scanned the page. Her face went white. "Jake," she whispered, her voice choked. "Look at this. Transport log. Contents. Toluene. Benzene. Xylene. They aren't just dumping, Jake. They're poisoning the groundwater." The hike back to the truck was executed in a grim, terrified silence. The storm provided a chaotic soundtrack, but beneath it, the two small, rain-soaked figures moving through the trees were an island of absolute focus. Elena clutched the waterproof case to her chest with her good arm, as if it were a life raft. The weight of its contents, toluene, benzene, xylene, felt heavy enough to sink her. Jake was in a different world. He was no longer a man hiding. He was a man on a patrol. His head, covered by the hood of his leather jacket, swiveled constantly, his eyes scanning the darkness, his senses screaming. He had the Zippo in his pocket, a cold, hard piece of proof that felt like a grenade. Max, sensing the shift in his owner, was in full tactical mode, a gray ghost scouting the path ahead, his movements silent and lethal. They reached the truck. The drive back to the cabin was even more tense. The only sounds inside the cab were the rhythmic, frantic thwack-thwack of the windshield wipers and the low rumble of the engine. "They'll come back to the station," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. "When they find the box gone—" "They won't know who took it," Jake said, his voice flat, his eyes locked on the treacherous, muddy road. "Could be kids, hikers, for now. But they'll know someone has it." Jake didn't reply. He was already calculating. He had brought the world to his door, and now he had to face the consequences. He turned off the main pass onto the hidden trail that led to his cabin. The truck's headlights cut a tunnel through the driving rain. They bumped and slid over the final rise, and the clearing opened up. The cabin was there. The small, warm light in the window was still on. A beacon of safety. Jake let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, and then he saw it. His foot hit the brake, sending the truck sliding to a halt in the mud. The headlights, which had been aimed at the ground, now illuminated the front of his cabin. The word was spray-painted across his front door, a grotesque dripping red against the dark-stained wood. "Leave." "Oh, no," Elena whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Jake said nothing. His body went absolutely, deathly still. He pushed the truck door open and stepped out into the rain, his movements slow, almost robotic. Max leaped out after him, a low growl starting in his chest. The red paint was still wet. It ran in streaks, like blood. They had been here. They had been here. "Jake," Elena started, getting out of the truck. "Stay there." Jake's voice was a dead, hollow command. He walked slowly toward the truck. He had seen the word, but his military mind was already checking the perimeter. He rounded the front of the truck. His flashlight beam, which he had pulled from his belt, flicked on. He aimed it at the front driver's side tire. It was flat, the rubber sagging into the mud. But it wasn't just flat. He knelt, the beam illuminating a long, clean slice in the sidewall. He moved the beam to the rear tire, slashed. A sick, cold dread filled his stomach. He didn't have to check the other side. He knew. This was not a warning. This was a message. This was containment. They were trapped. The attackers hadn't just found his cabin. They had been here, walked on his porch, taken their time. They had violated his safe space. The hissing sound of the last bits of air escaping the tire was suddenly the loudest sound in the world. The roar of the wind in the trees began to distort. It no longer sounded like wind. It sounded like shouting, a high-pitched, chaotic noise. The steady, hard beat of the rain on his leather jacket began to feel like hands shoving him. "Jake, we have to get inside," Elena said, her voice high with panic, holding the evidence box. He didn't hear her. He was standing, frozen, by the slashed tire. The world was narrowing to a pinprick. The red paint. The red. It was a marker. A target. They knew where he slept. They had been inside the wire. They had gotten past his defenses, and he hadn't even known. His breathing hitched. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead, instantly mixing with the rain. He felt a phantom heat, the smell of dust and cordite filling his nose, eclipsing the scent of pine and wet earth. "No, no, no," he whispered, his head starting to shake. He was not in Oregon. He was in a dusty, sun-baked alley, his rifle raised, his team. "Jake!" Elena screamed, running to him. He flinched, dropping the flashlight. He stumbled back, his hands coming up in a defensive posture, his eyes wide and unseeing. He was not looking at her. He was looking through her, at the ghosts that had just been given permission to return. "Jake, it's me. It's Elena." He couldn't hear her. He was hyperventilating, his body locked in a fight-or-flight response. The violation had broken the dam. He was drowning. He staggered to the porch, his back hitting one of the support posts. He slid down, his legs giving out, and landed in a sitting position, his head in his hands, his whole body shaking with violent, uncontrollable tremors. At that moment, Max moved. The dog, who had been growling at the shadows, saw his master fall. The threat of the intruders vanished, replaced by a more immediate, more important mission. He did not bark. He did not panic. He walked, with calm, deliberate purpose, onto the porch. He ignored Elena, who was standing, terrified, in the mud. He walked straight to Jake. Jake was rocking, a low, keening sound coming from his throat. Max pushed his heavy head under Jake's arm, forcing it up. Jake flinched at the touch, but the dog was insistent. Max pressed his cold, wet nose against Jake's neck, giving a low, deep whine. Then he stepped forward and, in a single, fluid motion, pushed his entire body against Jake's, forcing his way into his lap, pressing his chest against Jake's chest. He put his head on Jake's shoulder, his paws on his legs, and leaned in with all 80 pounds of his weight. This was not a cuddle. This was a command. It was deep pressure therapy, a technique the dog had been trained to perform. He was a living, breathing, weighted blanket. Jake's hands, which had been clenched into fists, flew open. He gasped, a ragged, choking sound. His fingers found the dog's thick, wet fur and gripped it, holding on as if he were a man drowning, and Max was the only solid thing in the ocean. "I'm here," Max seemed to say, his body a solid, warm, heavy presence. He whined again, a low-throated rumble, and licked the rain and tears from Jake's face. Slowly, agonizingly, the world began to return. The sound of shouting became the wind. The smell of cordite became the pine. The hands pushing him became the rain, and the warm, heavy weight on his chest, that was Max. That was real. He was in Oregon. He was on his porch. He was cold, but he was not in danger. Not that kind of danger. He let out a long, shuddering sob, burying his face in the dog's fur. His breathing was still ragged, but it was his breathing. Max had pulled him back from the edge. Elena stood there, her heart breaking. She was holding the box that had caused all this. She watched for a full minute as the man, the warrior who had saved her, was in turn saved by his dog. After a long time, Jake's breathing evened out. The shaking subsided. He was exhausted, his body limp. "Let's get inside," he managed, his voice a raw, broken whisper. He pushed himself up, using Max as a brace, and stumbled into the cabin. He didn't look at Elena. He couldn't. He was too ashamed. He went straight to his armchair and collapsed into it, pulling his knees to his chest, making himself small. Max immediately jumped up, curling his large body around him, a living shield. Elena came in, closing the splintered door behind her. The word leave stared at her. She set the evidence box on the table. The cabin was cold. She looked at Jake. He was staring at the wall, his eyes hollow. She didn't ask him if he was okay. She didn't ask what had happened. She walked past him to the small kitchen. She filled the kettle with water. She found the matches and lit the gas stove, the sound of the small burner hissing to life. She made 2 cups of tea, her hands shaking. She brought one over and placed it on the small side table next to his chair. She didn't sit in the other chair. That felt too much like an interrogation. Instead, she sat on the cold stone of the hearth, facing the fire, her back to him, but close. The only sound in the room was the wind and the sound of Jake's breathing slowly returning to normal. "My father," Elena said, her voice quiet, her words directed at her own cup. "He also tried to expose the truth in a small town." Jake's head turned just slightly. "He was a local reporter, a good one. He found out the mayor was taking kickbacks from a chemical plant, just like this. Different chemicals, same story." She took a sip of her tea. "They didn't slash his tires," she said, her voice becoming hard. "They ruined him, smeared his name, bankrupted him. He lost his job, his reputation, everything. He died a few years later, a broken man." She looked over her shoulder, meeting Jake's eyes. They were still haunted, but they were present. They were seeing her. "That's why I do this," she said, her voice fierce. "That's why I can't let them win. I won't let them do to this valley what they did to my father." Jake looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He didn't see a victim. He didn't see a stranger or a problem. He saw her scars. They were invisible, but they were as deep and as real as his own. She was a warrior too, just fighting a different kind of war. He said nothing, but he leaned forward, his hand still trembling, and picked up the cup of tea. The storm had broken with the dawn. The cabin, which had felt like a fortress under siege, was now unsettlingly quiet. The only sound was the steady drip, drip, drip of water falling from the massive firs onto the saturated earth. In the cold, gray morning light, the violations of the previous night were stark and ugly. The word "leave," painted in garish red on the front door, seemed to throb in the stillness. Outside, Jake's truck sat, defeated, its 4 tires completely flat, the clean slices in the rubber looking like surgical wounds. They were well and truly trapped. But the atmosphere inside the cabin had changed. The terror of the night, the raw, shared vulnerability, had burned away the tension between Jake and Elena. They were no longer captor and reluctant guest. They were allies, isolated and besieged. Elena was at the kitchen table, her face pale, but her eyes fierce. The waterproof box was open, and she was studying the map, comparing it to the transport logs. Her cracked ribs made her wince with every movement, but she didn't complain. Jake was not pacing. His movements were calm, deliberate. The PTSD attack had left him exhausted, hollowed out, but the shared confession with Elena, her story of her father, had grounded him in a way he hadn't been in years. He was packing a small waterproof rucksack, a canteen of water, a military-grade first aid kit, the crowbar. "The coordinates," Elena said, her finger tracing a line on the map. "They're all clustered in the same area. Section 9. It's marked as protected national forest land." "I know it," Jake said, his voice flat. He slung the rucksack over his shoulder. "It's about 3 miles north of here, over the ridge. Thick forest. No trails." "They're dumping it near a creek," she said, her voice dropping. "Willow Creek, the main creek." Jake paused, his hand on the door latch. "It's where the town gets its water." "Jake, they aren't just dumping it," she said, looking up at him, her eyes dark with the horrific realization. "Toluene, benzene, they're poisoning the aquifer, knowingly." A cold, hard anger settled in Jake's chest. This was no longer just about Elena. This was about his home. "Max," he called. The shepherd, who had been lying quietly at Elena's feet, was up in an instant, his claws ticking on the wood floor. He came to Jake's side, his gaze steady, his body alert. He knew the rucksack. He knew the tone. This was a workday. "We go on foot," Jake said to Elena. "Stick close. We don't know who is out there. If they slashed the tires, they might have left a watch." "I'm ready," she said, standing, her jaw set. Jake took one last look at the word "leave" on his door. He pushed it open, and the three of them stepped out into the clean, cold air of the morning after. The woods were a dripping green cathedral. The air smelled of wet earth, ozone, and pine. The ground was soft and muddy, sucking at their boots with every step. For the first hour, they moved in complete silence, Jake in the lead, his eyes scanning every shadow, every broken branch. Elena, her arm still in its sling, moved with a pained but grim determination. Max was the perfect scout. He ranged 50 yards ahead, a silent gray ghost weaving between the massive, moss-covered tree trunks. He would pause, his head up, testing the air, then move on, his paws making no sound on the carpet of damp needles. Jake led them up a steep incline, using his strength to help Elena over fallen logs. He was moving with a purpose he hadn't felt since he'd worn a uniform. This was a mission. He knew this land. He had hunted it as a boy with his father. He knew every game trail, every ridge, and he knew the men from Blackwood were not woodsmen. They were operators. They would be loud, and they would be careless. "According to the map," Elena whispered, breathing heavily as they crested the ridge. "The coordinates should be in this basin, near the water source." Jake nodded, holding up a hand for them to stop. He scanned the valley below. It was a dense, dark green, a pristine wilderness. He heard the distant rush of water. He was about to take a step forward when Max, 50 yards to their left, froze. He stopped so suddenly it was as if he had hit an invisible wall. His body went rigid, his head low, his tail straight. "Max," Jake called, his voice a low whisper. Max didn't turn. He lifted his nose, sniffing the air, his nostrils flaring. The wind, gentle now, was drifting up from the valley. Max was tasting it. He let out a low, uncertain whine, a sound of confusion, not aggression. This was a scent he had never encountered in the forest. He took a few cautious steps forward, his nose still in the air. Then he stopped and let out a single, sharp bark. It wasn't a bark at an animal or a person. It was a bark of alarm, directed at the valley itself. "What is it, boy?" Jake moved quickly, pushing through a screen of ferns, Elena right behind him. "What do you smell?" They broke through the brush and stopped, the sight hitting them like a physical blow. Below them was the creek, but it was not the clear, rushing water that Jake remembered. The water was a sickly, grotesque color. A milky, iridescent sheen, like oil on a puddle, coated the entire surface, swirling in slow, rainbow-colored patterns. The rocks on the bank, which should have been gray and green with moss, were stained with a dark, tarry-looking substance. But the smell was the worst part. It hit them in a wave, a bitter chemical odor that burned their noses and made their eyes water. It smelled of burnt plastic, solvents, and something metallic, a dead, sterile scent that choked out the natural smell of the pine. "Oh, heavens," Elena whispered, her good hand covering her nose. "Jake, they're doing it. They're doing it right now." The creek was dead. There were no birds, no insects. The normal sounds of the forest were gone, replaced by the gurgle of the poisoned water. Jake's anger was a cold, sharp blade. He looked at Max, who was now at the water's edge, refusing to drink, his nose wrinkled in disgust. "Good boy, Max," Jake said, his voice hard. "Find it." He didn't need the map anymore. He just needed the dog. Max, given the command, knew exactly what to do. His training, dormant for so long, took over. He was not a pet. He was a tracker. He lowered his nose, not to the water, but to the bank, and began sniffing the patches of discolored mud. He let out another sharp bark and began to move. "He's got it," Jake said. "He's tracking the source. Let's go." They moved upstream, following the dog. Elena scrambled to keep up. Her camera, which she had protected in her jacket, now in her hand, documenting the dead water. Max was relentless. He moved with a focused, frantic energy, his nose just inches from the ground, following the trail of spilled poison. He led them away from the main creek, up a smaller tributary, a gully that had been carved out by the storm's runoff. After another 100 yards, the gully opened up into a small, hidden clearing. Jake stopped. "Elena!" The clearing was a scene of utter desolation. It was a sea of mud, churned and rutted by the deep, heavy tracks of dual-axle trucks. The ground was black and oily. Dozens of large, 55-gallon drums were piled haphazardly at the edge of the clearing, some overturned, leaking their viscous contents directly onto the ground. The sludge was flowing in a small river down the gully, directly into the creek they had just left. This was the dump site. "They used the storm," Elena said, her voice shaking with rage as she snapped photos. "They used the noise and the rain to cover their tracks, to wash it all downstream." Max wasn't looking at the barrels. He was in the center of the muddy clearing, his attention fixed on a patch of freshly disturbed earth, a mound of dirt and rock that had been crudely bulldozed over to cover something. He sniffed it once, twice, and then he began to dig. He dug with a frantic, desperate energy, his powerful front paws sending clumps of toxic mud flying. "Max, easy!" Jake called, moving toward him. But Max wouldn't stop. He was obsessed. He dug, whined, and dug deeper until he was shoulder-deep in the hole. Then he braced his back legs and pulled. He pulled back, his muscles straining, and something came free from the mud with a wet, sucking sound. It wasn't a stick. He dropped it at Jake's feet, then backed away, shaking his head, trying to get the foul taste out of his mouth. Jake stared at the object. Elena moved closer, aiming her camera, her flash firing in the dim forest light. It was a heavy-duty work glove, black, thick rubber, reaching almost to the elbow. It was caked in the same leaking, iridescent sludge. The chemical smell coming from it was overpowering, a concentrated wave of poison. Jake knelt. He didn't touch it. He just stared. The Zippo had linked Blackwood to the attack. The maps had shown the plan. This glove, pulled from a shallow grave by his dog, was the physical proof. It was the smoking gun, covered in the poison, that was bleeding into their town. The walk back from the poisoned creek was a grim, silent march. The woods were no longer a sanctuary. They were a crime scene. Elena, despite her injuries, clutched the precious stack of photographs she had taken, her camera tucked safely back under her jacket. Jake carried the heavy, foul-smelling glove, double-bagged in plastic from his emergency kit, with the same grim determination as a soldier carrying a captured enemy standard. They reached the cabin in the cold, clear light of midday. The word "leave" on the door seemed to mock them, a stark reminder that they were trapped. "We have it all," Elena said, her voice hoarse. She collapsed into the armchair, the adrenaline that had kept her going finally draining away, leaving only pain and exhaustion. The logs, the maps, the Zippo, and now this? She nodded at the bagged glove, which Jake had placed on the kitchen table, a toxic centerpiece. "We have the proof," Jake said, his eyes on the slashed tires visible through the window. "But we have no way to deliver it. We're cut off." "Ben," Elena said. "Sheriff Carter. He'll come looking for us, won't he?" "Maybe," Jake said, his voice flat. "And what if Blackwood's men get here first? They know we're here. They know we're trapped. They'll be back to clean up." Elena's face went pale. He was right. They hadn't just been warned. They had been contained. Jake walked to the wall, his back to her. His hand went to Max, who had taken up a silent vigil by his side, sensing the tension. Jake's mind was working, the old tactical part of him, the part he hated, taking over. "They'll be watching the roads," Jake said, thinking aloud. "They'll be watching the clinic, the station. They'll expect us to be here, waiting." "So what do we do?" Elena whispered. Jake turned. His face was a mask of cold resolve, the man who had hidden from the world for 2 years gone, replaced by the soldier. "They'll watch the roads. They won't watch the ridges." "Jake, no. she said, understanding. "It's miles. You'd have to go cross-country. They'll be looking for you. They'll be looking for a man in a truck, not a man in the trees." He grabbed his rucksack, the same one from the hike, and began checking its contents. "I won't go to the station. Ben's deputy is a mole. I'll go to his house." He paused, his hands on the bag. He looked at Max. The dog looked back, his intelligent eyes unblinking. "You stay," Jake commanded, his voice soft but firm. "Watch her. You keep her safe. That's your job." Max let out a low, quiet whine, his gaze shifting from Jake to Elena and back, but he didn't move. He understood. Jake turned to Elena. "Keep the door bolted. Don't open it for anyone but me or Ben. If anyone else comes, use the fireplace. The back flue, you can climb out, run for the creek. Max will show you. Just don't get caught." Elena just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She watched as he shouldered the rucksack, which now contained the bag glove, the Zippo, and the logbook. He slid out the back window, as silent as a ghost, and disappeared into the dense forest, leaving her alone with the dog and the weight of the silence. The hike was a brutal, focused ascent. Jake moved with a ground-eating lope, his body fueled by a cold, precise rage. Every snapped twig, every rustle of a bird in the undergrowth made his muscles jump, but he pushed the fear down. This was not a panic attack. This was a mission. He skirted the town, staying high in the foothills, moving through shadows and forgotten game trails. It was late afternoon when he finally reached the quiet residential street on the edge of town where Ben Carter lived. He didn't go to the front door. He slipped through the back gate and knocked on the kitchen door, a quiet, coded rhythm. The door flew open. Ben Carter stood there, his service revolver in his hand, his face a mask of profound relief. "Jake, I was about to come to you. My gut's been—" "They were here, Ben," Jake said, stepping inside, his eyes scanning the street. He dropped the rucksack on the kitchen table. "They hit the cabin, slashed my tires, left a message." He unzipped the bag and laid the evidence out. The logbook, the Zippo, and finally the double-bagged glove. Carter's face went from pale to ashen. He stared at the items. What is this?" "That," Jake said, pointing to the glove, "is what Max pulled out of a toxic waste dump in Section 9. They're not just dumping, Ben. They're poisoning the aquifer, Willow Creek." Ben Carter's weariness vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened fury. He was no longer a small-town sheriff. He was an officer of the law witnessing the attempted murder of his entire town. "Toluene, benzene," Ben read from the log Elena had copied. He knew. Blackwood knew. "Your deputy is on his payroll," Jake stated. "I know," Ben said, his voice grim. "Gates. He's been feeding them information for months. That's why we can't do this here. We can't use the local courthouse. We can't trust anyone in this town." He walked to his phone, but not his cell, his old wall-mounted landline. He picked it up and dialed a number from memory. "Ben, what are you doing?" "Fighting back," Carter said. "I can't go through my own department, so I'm going over them. Way over." The phone clicked. "Maria, it's Ben Carter." "Yes, it has been too long. Listen, I don't have time. I need a favor, and I need it now. I have an active, ongoing Class A environmental felony, conspiracy to commit murder, and I have a compromised department. I need a search warrant, and I need it executed by an outside agency. State Police. Now?" He listened. "Yes, the evidence is physical. I have chain of custody, I have transport logs, I have the poison itself, and I have a Zippo lighter belonging to the Prime Suspects Corporation found at the scene of the attempted murder of my witness. Yes, it's that bad. Judge Maria Alvarez, I need your help." There was a long pause. "Thank you, Maria," Ben said, a wave of relief washing over his face. He hung up. "A trusted judge in the next county," he explained to Jake. "She's signing the warrant as we speak. It's going directly to the State Police Barracks in Lakeview. They're mobilizing a TAC team. They'll be here in the morning. They're going to hit Blackwood's offices. They're going to shut him down." The next morning, Nathaniel Blackwood was enjoying his coffee. His office, on the top floor of the Blackwood Logging Building, was paneled in rich mahogany and overlooked the entire valley. He was a man in his 50s with a confident, arrogant air, his expensive suit perfectly tailored. His phone rang. It was his man, the one who had handled the reporter. "She's not at the clinic," the voice said. "And the hermit. His truck's still there, tires flat, but the cabin's empty. They're gone." Blackwood's smile faded. "What about Gates?" "He's at the station, hasn't seen Carter since yesterday." "Find them," Blackwood ordered, his voice dropping to a dangerous chill. "Find them all. I want this handled. Today." He hung up, annoyed at the incompetence, and turned to his computer. He was reviewing a new multi-million-dollar contract for waste disposal when the sound of heavy boots echoed from the hallway. The door to his office didn't open. It burst open, slamming against the wall. Two men in dark blue state police tactical gear entered, weapons held low, followed by a sharp, professional-looking woman in a state police captain's uniform. "Nathaniel Blackwood?" she asked, her voice sharp and cold. Blackwood stood up, his face a mask of outraged disbelief. "What is the meaning of this? Who do you think you—" "You are under arrest for the attempted murder of Elena Hayes, the illegal disposal of hazardous materials, and—" She pulled a document from her folder. "A whole list of other charges. This is a warrant for your arrest and for the seizure of all materials in this office." Blackwood stared at the paper. It was signed by Judge Maria Alvarez. "This is impossible," he stammered. This is my town." "Not anymore," the captain said. "Cuff him." That evening, a different knock came at the cabin door. Max, who had been sleeping at Elena's feet, didn't growl. He stood, his tail giving one tentative wag. "It's Ben," Jake said, unbolting the door. Sheriff Carter looked 100 years old and 10 years younger, all at the same time. He was exhausted, but he was smiling. "It's done," he said, slumping into the armchair Elena had vacated. "What happened?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. "The state police raid was perfect," Carter said. "They got Blackwood, and they got his computers, the real logs. He wasn't just dumping for himself. He was charging corporations from 3 states to dispose of their toxic waste. He's been using this logging operation as a front for years, poisoning the groundwater, all for a massive profit." "The full conspiracy," Elena whispered. "The full conspiracy," Ben confirmed. "We got him, and in the middle of it all, we got Deputy Gates. Caught him in the station, trying to wipe the servers. He's in a state holding cell right now, singing like a canary, trying to save himself." A silence filled the room, a silence that was the opposite of the one that had been there before. This was not tension. This was release. Elena sat down heavily on the hearth, her good hand covering her face, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs of relief. Jake stood by the window, his hand resting on Max's head. He looked out at the woods, which suddenly seemed like his home again, not his prison. Ben Carter looked at him. "Your father, Michael. He always said this town was worth fighting for." He stood up, placing a heavy hand on Jake's shoulder. "He would have been so proud of you, son, so proud." Jake closed his eyes, his throat tight, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt something other than the need to run. He felt peace. The victory was hollow. The arrests had not been made. Sheriff Carter had returned to the cabin not with a smile of triumph, but with the grim, set face of a man who had been outmaneuvered. "We got the office," he announced, standing in the doorway, his uniform soaked from a new, lighter rain. He didn't enter. The state police raid was by the book. They seized the computers, the real servers, the ones that proved the whole conspiracy. Elena, who had been sitting at the table, stood up. But they're gone," Carter said, his voice flat. "We hit the station to arrest Gates. He was already gone, cleaned out his locker. He must have heard the state police mobilizing in the next county and tipped off Blackwood. They're both in the wind." Jake, who had been cleaning the mud from the floor, stopped. "So they're still out there, armed and desperate." "Cornered," Carter agreed, his hand rubbing his weary face. "We've got roadblocks on the highway, but this is their valley. They know 100 logging roads we don't. A sharp, static-filled burst of noise cut him off. It was the radio on his shoulder. A voice, not a dispatcher, but a cold, clear, and arrogant voice filled the cabin. "Sheriff Carter, I know you can hear me. This is Blackwood." Jake, Elena, and Carter froze. "You've taken my company," the voice continued, smooth and controlled, but with a terrifying, unhinged energy just beneath it. "You've turned my town against me, but you haven't won." "Where are you, Blackwood?" Carter said, his thumb on the transmit button. "Your deputy, Gates," Blackwood's voice crackled. "He was disappointing. He thought he could serve two masters. He's no good to me now. He's here, Ben, at the old sawmill on Route 12. A pause, then a faint sound of a scuffle, and another voice, Gates, yelling, "Sheriff, don't! It's a—" The sound was abruptly cut off. "He wants to negotiate," Blackwood said, his tone mocking. "He thinks you can save him. I'll tell you what. Come alone. We'll have our own negotiation. You have 30 minutes, or I'll finish what your deputy started and leave his body in the river." The radio clicked, followed by dead silence. "It's a trap," Jake said instantly. "It's an ambush." "He's luring you," Elena said, her face pale. "Gates isn't his hostage. He's his partner. They're luring you there to kill you." "I know," Carter said quietly. He looked at Jake, his eyes filled with a grim resolve. "He's still my deputy, and this is still my town. I have to go." "Ben, you won't even make it through the door," Jake argued. "They're expecting one man, me. They're not expecting the state police, who are still sweeping the East End. This is the only chance to get them both. I'm going in." Carter turned to Jake. "Whatever happens, you stay here. You keep her safe. That's an order, Jake." Carter turned and walked out into the rain, his steps heavy. They watched him get into his cruiser and drive away, his taillights disappearing into the mist. For a long moment, the cabin was silent. "He's not going alone," Jake said. Elena nodded, already grabbing her coat. "I know." Jake turned to Max, who was standing, his head tilted, watching his owner. "We're going to hunt, boy." Max's tail gave one silent, powerful thump. Jake's truck was useless. They went on foot. They cut cross-country, moving through the woods that ran parallel to the road. Jake moved with a speed and silence that Elena, even in her injured state, found herself matching. The adrenaline, the shared sense of purpose, masked the pain. Max was a gray phantom, moving ahead of them, scouting the path, his paws making no sound on the wet carpet of pine needles. The old sawmill was a skeleton in the twilight. It sat by the river, a sprawling complex of rotting wood and rusted, corrugated metal. A large, dark blue sedan, Blackwood's, was parked near a side entrance. Sheriff Carter's cruiser was parked out front, empty. Jake, Elena, and Max slipped from the woods, using the piles of rotting lumber as cover. "Stay here," Jake whispered to Elena, positioning her behind a stack of 2x4s. "No matter what you hear, you stay here. Jake, be careful." He nodded, put a hand on Max's head, and the two of them disappeared into the deep shadows of the building, slipping through a gap where a wall had long since rotted away. The inside of the sawmill smelled of decay, sawdust, and the sharp metallic tang of the river. It was a vast open space filled with the dark, silent shapes of machinery. A single, bare bulb hung from a wire in the center, casting a weak yellow circle of light. Jake and Max moved in the darkness, climbing a set of stairs to a rickety catwalk that ran along the length of the building. From here, they could see the entire scene below. Sheriff Ben Carter stood in the center of the light, his hands raised slightly, away from his weapon. He looked calm. "It's over, Blackwood," Carter said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "It's over when I say it is." Nathaniel Blackwood's voice came from the shadows. He stepped into the light. His expensive suit was torn and stained with mud. His hair was wild. He was holding a heavy hunting rifle, and his eyes were filled with the flat, dead light of a desperate man. And beside him, just as the summary had predicted, was Deputy Gates. Gates was not a hostage. He was a partner. He was holding his service revolver, and it was aimed steadily with both hands at Ben Carter's chest. "You really are a fool, old man," Gates sneered, his voice shaking, but his aim true. "Did you think you could win?" "You're an officer of the law, Gates," Carter said, his voice full of a cold disappointment. "I was a man on a payroll," Gates shot back, "and you just cost me my retirement. Drop the gun belt, Sheriff." Slowly, Carter's hands moved to his belt. "He's going to do it," Jake whispered, his body tensing. He was 40 feet away, on the catwalk. Too far to jump, too far to shoot, even if he had a gun. Below, Gates took a step closer to Carter, his own weapon still raised. "Do it! Now!" Blackwood laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "You ruined me, Ben, but I get the last laugh. I get to watch my town, my real town, die. And you get to go first." Gates took a deep breath, his finger tightening on the trigger. He was centering his aim on Carter's chest. This was the moment. Jake didn't speak. He didn't have to. He just put his hand on Max's shoulder and gave a single downward push. It was the command. Hit. Max was a gray and black missile. He did not bark. He did not hesitate. He launched himself from the catwalk, a silent 80-pound projectile. He sailed through the air, landing on a stack of pallets below with a soundless thud, and then he exploded across the floor. Gates, his focus entirely on Carter, heard the sound of claws on the wooden floorboards, a sound like gravel being raked, and he made the mistake of turning his head. He had just enough time to widen his eyes. Max hit him. He didn't go for the arm or the gun. He hit him full force, using his entire body weight, a battering ram of fur and muscle, striking him square in the chest. The impact was brutal, a sickening thud of a body being hit, and a loud gasp as the air was punched from Gates's lungs. Gates was knocked off his feet, his body flying backward. The gun fired. A sharp, deafening crack echoed through the sawmill, but the bullet went wild, harmlessly splintering a rafter high above. The moment Max was in the air, Jake was moving. He didn't take the stairs. He vaulted over the railing of the catwalk, dropping 10 feet to land in a roll on the sawdust-covered floor. Blackwood, startled by the sudden chaos, turned and tried to swing the heavy rifle toward the new threat. He was a businessman, not a fighter. Jake was a soldier. He closed the distance in 2 strides. He didn't go for the rifle. He went for the man. He stepped inside the rifle's range, deflecting the barrel with his left arm. His right hand, a rigid palm, struck Blackwood under the chin, snapping his head back. As Blackwood stumbled, Jake didn't stop. He used his combat training, a fast, efficient, and brutal series of strikes. An elbow to the solar plexus, a disabling blow to the man's knee. Blackwood collapsed like a puppet, all the fight gone from him, the rifle clattering uselessly to the floor. It was over in 3 seconds. A profound silence fell, broken only by the sound of the rain and the desperate pained gasps of the 2 men on the floor. Deputy Gates was on his back, trying to get his breath, his pistol 10 feet away. Max stood over him, one paw on his chest, a deep, bone-vibrating growl coming from his throat. Blackwood was on his knees, clutching his ribs, disarmed and neutralized. Sheriff Carter, his own gun now drawn, was covering them both. Elena ran in from the darkness, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. Jake stood, breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly beginning to recede. He walked over to Max and put a hand on his head. The growling stopped, but the dog didn't move his paw. Carter holstered his weapon. He looked at Gates, then at Blackwood, then at Jake. He let out a long, slow breath. "Your timing," he said, a small, tired smile touching his lips, "is almost as good as your father's." The first light of dawn was just beginning to break, a cold, gray line on the horizon, as the first of the state police cruisers arrived at the sawmill. The flashing blue and red lights cut through the rain, reflecting in chaotic, strobing patterns on the wet sawdust and rusted metal. Jake and Elena stood back, watching from the shadows as the professionals took over. Nathaniel Blackwood, his face a mask of stone-cold fury and disbelief, offered no resistance. His expensive suit was ruined, his hands cuffed behind him. He looked like what he was, a king deposed, his empire of deceit crumbling. Deputy Gates was another story. He was sobbing, a pathetic, broken sound as he was led away. The reality of his betrayal, of his town, his badge, and himself, had come crashing down. Sheriff Ben Carter stood in the middle of it all, his shoulders slumped with an exhaustion that went bone deep, but his eyes were clear. He was directing traffic, pointing, giving quiet orders. The law had, at last, come to Willow Creek. As the sun rose, the news spread through the town like a current. The sawmill, a symbol of the town's industry, had become the scene of its liberation. The following days were a blur of new activity. The roadblocks came down, but new trucks came up the pass. These were not logging trucks. They were large, white, unmarked vehicles, and men in stark white hazardous material suits emerged, looking like astronauts on a strange, new world. The toxic waste cleanup had begun. They descended on Section 9, the clearing that Jake, Elena, and Max had discovered. It was cordoned off, a massive ongoing operation to scrape the poison from the earth, to filter the water, to drill test wells. It was a scar on the land, one that would take years to fully heal, but the process of healing had, at least, started. Elena did not go back to Portland. She did not even pack. She stayed. Her battle had been fought with instincts and fear. Now it would be fought with words. She set up a temporary base in the back booth of the Willow Creek Diner, fueled by endless cups of coffee and the quiet, respectful nods of the locals. Her laptop, plugged into the wall by the jukebox, became her weapon. The clicking of the keys was a rapid, furious sound. The story she wrote was not just an article, it was an indictment. It was a eulogy for the town that had been, and a declaration for the town that could be. She named Nathaniel Blackwood. She named Deputy Gates. She named the chemical compounds, toluene, benzene, xylene. She printed the logs from the waterproof box. She published her own stark, heartbreaking photos of the iridescent dead water. The story. The poison beneath us, how one man bought a town and poisoned its water, was explosive. She ran it in the Willow Creek Gazette, the small, dusty local paper whose elderly editor, long terrified of Blackwood, had been only too happy to sell it to her for $1. The story was picked up by the Associated Press and then by the national news. Willow Creek, a town no one had ever heard of, was suddenly the subject of a national conversation about corporate greed and environmental justice. But Elena stayed put. She wasn't interested in the New York talk shows. She was interested in the Gazette. She was the new editor, publisher, and chief reporter. She had found her purpose, not in the big city, but in this small, wounded valley. Jake went back to the cabin. For 2 days, he just sat on the porch, watching the woods, Max's head in his lap. The red-painted word, "Leave," was still on his door, a constant, ugly reminder. He looked at it. He thought about the man he had been, the man who had hidden here, terrified of the world, convinced that solitude was the only answer. He had been wrong. Solitude wasn't safety. It was just a different kind of trap. He had been violated, but he was not broken. He was changed. On the 3rd day, he went to his shed. He pulled out his old orbital sander, ran a fresh extension cord, and with a steady hand, he pressed the buzzing disc to the red paint. The high-pitched whine of the motor was a defiant cleansing sound in the quiet clearing. He sanded until the wood was raw, clean, and new. He was not leaving. He was staying. He spent the next week patching the slashed tires on his truck, his movements efficient and precise. He looked at Max, who was watching him, a stick in his mouth. Max wasn't just his anchor. He was a hero. The dog's instincts, his training, his loyalty, they hadn't just saved Jake from his own mind. They had saved Elena. They had saved Carter. They had saved the town. He realized his skills, and Max's, were not something to be hidden. They were something to be shared. He drove his newly repaired truck into town. He walked into the sheriff's station, past the new young deputy, and found Ben Carter sitting at his desk, which was, for the first time, not piled high with files. "Ben," Jake said, his voice clear. "Jake," Carter smiled, standing up. "You're a hard man to find, even when you're not hiding." "I have an idea," Jake said, bypassing the small talk. "There are other vets out there, like I was, lost, hiding. This valley, it's a good place, but it's hard for them. I want to start a center, a small one, up on my land, to train rescue dogs for the county. We're in the mountains. We need them." He paused, then got to the real point. "But mostly, I want to train therapy dogs, like Max, to partner them with the men and women who come back from the war, the ones who need an anchor." Sheriff Carter looked at Jake, the Cuban who had hidden from the world, who had refused his first request for help. He saw the new man standing in his place, a man with purpose, with clear eyes, and a plan. "You know, Jake," Carter said, placing a heavy, proud hand on his shoulder, "your father always said you had a good heart. He just worried you'd never find a big enough reason to use it. I think you just found it." Spring came to the Cascades, a slow, gentle wave of green. The rain stopped, and the sun, for the first time in what felt like a year, was warm. On a bright Sunday afternoon, 3 figures walked the trail along the bank of Willow Creek, in the very same Section 9 that had once been a toxic grave. The EPA had finished the first phase of its cleanup. The barrels were gone. The toxic earth had been removed. The creek, fed by the snowmelt, was running fast and clear. The sound of the water, a happy, rushing gurgle over clean stones, was the only sound in the valley. Max, unburdened, ran ahead. He was no longer a tactical canine or a therapy anchor. He was just a dog. He splashed into the shallows, a spray of clean water, and lapped eagerly at the creek, a simple, joyous act that would have been a death sentence 3 months prior. Jake watched him. His flannel shirt was unbuttoned, his beard neatly trimmed. The haunted, weathered lines around his eyes had softened. He stopped walking, and his hand found Elena's. She was no longer the pale victim from the wreck. Her arm was healed. Her hair, which had grown longer, was tied back. She was the editor of the Willow Creek Gazette, and she was smiling. They didn't speak. They just stood together, watching their dog play in the clean water. They had faced the darkness. They had found the truth. They had found justice. And they had found their purpose. And here, together, in the quiet, healing wilderness, with the sound of a dawn on clear water, they had finally, truly, found peace. The journey of Jake and Max reminds us that no one is ever truly lost as long as one loyal heart remembers where they are. It is the simple, unspoken devotion of an animal that often provides the courage we need to heal ourselves, and, in doing so, heal the world around us. If this story resonated with you, we hope you will join our community by subscribing. We would be honored if you shared your own thoughts in the comments or let us know you enjoyed the tale with a like. Every share helps these stories of loyalty find a new home. And if you are ready for another journey, the next story is already waiting for you, right here on the screen.